Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Kavat. Military exercises and partnerships are proliferating in the Indo-Pacific region, a response to increasing aggressions around Taiwan, the Koreas and in the East and South China Seas. To discuss where all this is leading are Alessio Patalano, King's College London, Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia, and Chen Binghui, National Zhengzhi University Department of Diplomacy Associate Professor. Alessio, Binghui, a very warm welcome to the show today.
Thank you.
In mid-August, a Philippine Coast Guard ship was attempting a resupply mission in the South China Sea. When it was first blocked, as you can see here, by Chinese Coast Guard ships and then fired on by water cannon, forcing the mission to abort. The Philippine vessel was trying to resupply troops living on the World War II-era ship Sierra Armada. The warship is intentionally grounded on the second Thomas Shoal to reinforce Manila's sovereignty over the atoll, one of hundreds of reefs, islets and islands also claimed by China. Beijing aggressively asserts its claim to most of the South China Sea under a historical map it calls the Nine-Dash Line. It has demanded the Philippines remove the grounded ship. Binghui, let me come to you first. So the Philippine Coast Guard has since then, had a successful completion of its mission to resupply. We've also seen the first trilateral Navy drills between the US, Japan, and Australia in the West Philippine Sea, hosted by the Philippines. So can you paint us a picture of what is happening, how things are evolving in the South China Sea?
Okay, so the incident in the military drill is not entirely related because the military drill was set a couple months ago. The trilateral drill was between Australia, Japan, and the US. And then the Philippines, it doesn't participate in the drill. It shows that there are more and more regional countries are getting concerned about China's aggressive claims on the South China Sea. And the Philippines, of course, try to secure its claim on the second Thomas Shoal. This has been a long dispute between China and the Philippines. Each side tried to take over the second Thomas Shoal throughout the years. Now the Philippines had control on it.
Alessio, are you surprised perhaps by Professor Chen mentioned that this has been many years, since 1999, that warship was grounded there. So we're talking decades. And this is the first sort of show of force, the first sort of trilateral drills in the region.
So in this respect, I think there's 3 points to make. The first one is that exercises are a manifestation of statecraft. They are first and foremost about training together and enhance your readiness, the quality of your capabilities. So in this respect, the first thing to say is that the significance of the exercise is that it's taking place in the Philippines, even though, as the professor was saying, absolutely right, this is something that had been already organized. But what they did, they tried not to miss the opportunity to add an element of stronger political signaling in doing so. And the other thing is the exercise, if you look at it, it's a manifestation of a growing trilateral partnership between the United States and Japan and Australia. So it's a growing relationship. And the third element, it's the complexity of the exercise itself. It's not just about the political symbolism. It's not just about the signaling and the manifestation of a growing trilateral ties. But if you look at the content of it, it's also about exercising very complex military maneuvers, which is a manifestation of the quality of the coming together in itself.
Yeah, one of the, what's also included in the drills is amphibious landings.
You're touching upon a very important point, because amphibious warfare, we know it's perhaps the most complex component of war at sea, or from the sea in this case, because it combines elements that operate these days over 4 different dimensions. You've got the underwater, the surface, you've got in the air, and then in the sky and from space in terms of coordinating networks and delivery of military effect, as it were. So it's a really complex set of maneuvers, but it also tells us something else about the broader Indo-Pacific, and certainly some of its key basins, whether it is the East China Sea, the Straits of Taiwan, or the South China Sea, the presence of so many smaller islands, inlets, reefs and shores. It tells us something about the specific importance that amphibious warfare has in this part of the world.
Absolutely. And Bing-Wei, just so our audience understands, we've got the involvement, the hosting by the Philippines, obviously that this is to do with the dispute, as we said, in the South China Sea, just talking about the drills here. The US, because the US, in a sense, has the role of maybe a global policeman, anyway, the upholder of rules, international rules-based order. How about Japan and Australia? What's their interest in the South China Sea?
That's the interesting part. For a very long time, Japan and Australia has been trying to steer away from the South China Sea dispute. They didn't want to take any claims. Of course, they don't want to take sides on the South China Sea issues. Even when the U.S. announced that China was building the artificial islands since 2012, Japan and Australia didn't voice. Didn't object the artificial island and all sorts of things. But more recently, you see Japan and Australia are getting more and more concerned about China's behavior in South China Seas. And these behavior may affect their own security as well. On the other side, it is the Biden administration who can convoke those allies to do things for the United States, because the U.S. has a core interest in South China Sea, freedom of navigation, passage of commercial and military ships. So this is a very important sea line for the United States Navy. So it's mainly the U.S. interest. However, the U.S. is able to convince Japan and Australia to take care of its interests. I think this is pretty important.
Pretty significant. And so, we're sort of touching on a theme, which is navies, or the modernization of navies. And Alessio, very briefly, in your latest book, you talk about the new age of naval power. Very quickly, what's brought on this new age?
Well, this is something actually that relates to what we've just discussed, because in the past, navies, and certainly in the 20th century, if you think about the naval treaties of the interwar period and the Cold War confrontation between the two superpowers, navies had become somehow a benchmark of where you stand in the international order. And so there was very much a correlation between that hardcore military power to your standing in the pecking order of international affairs. But I think what we're looking at now is something very different, because with the coming of the age of the law of the sea and the appearance of UNCLOS and the UNCLOS process, you have another layer to this. International order, the global order at sea, is not just about power differential and how it reflects on a country's standing. It is also about how a country behaves in relation to these absolutely essential principles.
And that's very interesting, because Bing-Wei, what we have is the US, which is not party to UNCLOS, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it is upholding the rules. So on that level, Alessio is obviously very high up. And then you've got China, which is a party to that law, and yet it appears to be flouting many of those rules, and obviously doesn't even accept the 2016 tribunal ruling, which said that its claims to the South China Sea are illegal.
Right. I think this shows a very realistic picture of the international politics. Countries, especially great powers, would choose the rules they want to obey. Of course, there are limits.
Okay. Alessio, could you draw in an assessment of the Chinese Navy versus the US Navy? Obviously, the expansion of the Chinese Navy is at a rate much faster than the US's.
It is, and it is undeniable that there is a growing differential in terms of capabilities. If you take most of the open source assessments, even official assessments in the United States, numerically speaking, The Chinese Navy now is setting the pace, if you want, and it stands in a context where its fleet, not only the Navy but also the Coast Guard, now they are at the very top of the international pinnacle. But there is something about naval war and war at sea that is just more about capabilities. It's also about how you translate numerical substance into military effectiveness. And I think that's where still, to a degree, we'll see for quite some time the United States and partners of the United States, not least because of how they continuously are in conversation with each other in order to maintain the sharper end of the complexity of the maritime system from a military perspective to come together.
Okay, fascinating. Perhaps two of the biggest security players in the Indo-Pacific region are Australia and Japan, and both have signed an agreement to deepen their security cooperation and facilitate joint drills. To find out more, I spoke to our next guest, Stephen Nagy, International Christian University Professor of Politics and International Studies. Let's take a look.
The reciprocal access agreement between Australia and Japan is not an alliance. It's not a commitment to fight each other. Rather, it is an agreement where they joint train. The Japanese can send their troops to Australia and train with the Australians, and vice versa. It also gives the Australians and Japanese the opportunity to do locate resources in each other's countries.
The agreements are not a commitment to fight together, but they are a commitment to train together. Why train together? What are you training for?
Well, I think whatever the security partnership Japan is investing in, whether it's the Australian Reciprocal Access Agreement, the UK Reciprocal Access Agreement, or this new Camp David agreement between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, is that the countries are trying to build what we call shared norms, shared human capacity, and shared understandings of how each uses its self-defense forces or its military, so they can work more coherently together in the case that they have to move towards pushing back against an aggressor state within the region. It's really difficult to conceive, for example, Japan and Australia being able to deal with a Taiwan contingency, for example, without deeply familiarizing themselves with each other's command structure, the institutions that they use to provide a defense capability, and an understanding of their counterparts in Australia.
And how do you read such a development? I mean, how significant is it that these countries are taking these steps at the moment?
Well, what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years is much more assertive behavior by China in the South China Sea through gray zone operations and, of course, building and militarizing artificial islands in the South China Sea. We've seen the military drills around Taiwan, whether it was August 2022 after Nancy Pelosi's visit, or the recent drills following candidate Lai's visit to the United States on the way to Paraguay. Countries are worried about China's behavior because it's going to affect sea lines of communication. Potentially, it could disrupt and force a unification with Taiwan. What would that mean for its democratic institutions? And importantly, Taiwan's place in the semiconductor supply chain. So countries are deeply concerned about what's happening in the region. They understand that if there is a kinetic conflict or a military conflict, that it will not stay in the Taiwan Straits. It will spill over and become a regional conflict.
Professor Chen, so I put the question to Stephen, I'll put the same question to you. How significant is this development in terms of pacifist Japan joining forces with Australia?
I think it's not just pacifist Japan. I think Japan has changed a lot since the revise of its constitution. I think the significance is that two non-allies are willing to sign this kind of agreement. Mutual access agreement, we usually call this kind of agreement as defense cooperation agreement. You only sign this agreement because you have some obligations and privileges and rights to clarify. For example, if you're gonna access certain ports, what kind of ports you can access, what kind of services you can access. Do you need to pay? And if your personnel are on the ground, and what are their rights and privileges? These are the agreements that talks about the details of mutual cooperations. Usually, it's under a greater treaty, a greater framework, usually a treaty, a defense treaty. But we know that Japan and Australia doesn't have a defense treaty, and as the professor just said, this agreement doesn't constitute any commitment, defense commitment. So what it tells us is that the U.S. is able to integrate its two most important allies in East Asia, and ask them to cooperate with each other. Now, this cooperation will benefit the U.S. because, as we mentioned, that during the Taiwan contingency or East China Sea contingency, for example, and when U.S. need to use its force in East Asia, and it will need the support from the allies, and these allies will need to travel to each other and provide, for example, logistic support, and then this kind of agreement will be useful. So I think this is something that we cannot imagine during Trump's presidency. So this is really something that U.S. has accomplished, and it is very significant from the U.S. point of view.
Alessio, a significant accomplishment by the Biden administration, bringing these allies together, spoke to spoke.
I would probably suggest that happened before the Biden administration. The Biden administration took advantage and consolidated. Let's not forget that the CTPPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, came together during the Trump years because of Australia and Japan, and it was led by the Japanese and Australian efforts. I think the mid-2010s were a very important a point in time whereby medium actors like Australia and Japan stepped up to the plate and took on some element of leadership in the region. In the South China Sea, there's a point that Professor Chen sort of mentioned earlier, which I think is very important. It was not at the invitation of the United States that Japan stepped up its security, responsibility, or responsible behavior in security terms in the South China Sea. It was in light of the awards that you mentioned in 2016. And in 2017, the Japanese started what now they call the Indo-Pacific deployment, which is the summer-long deployment in the South China Sea. And it was very much their initiative as a way to link the importance of maintaining a rule-based order, perhaps in a less conspicuous American leadership.
And can you talk about the, Professor spoke about the things like access to ports. Stephen Nagy spoke about, the joint training. Do militaries always train together, or is this a little bit more? Is it actually training for certain contingencies, for example, a Taiwan contingency?
So there is certainly an element of that, but I would take a slightly step back on this point, in the sense that it depends very much what's the regional context for that military cooperation. In Western Europe, NATO has its own sort of structures from the operational level upwards. It has a schedule of activities and national realities that are part also of NATO. They organize themselves in order that their own national training invites other members and complement that. You don't have that in the Indo-Pacific. The bilateral agreements that the United States has in the region is perhaps the first and only port of call. And so everybody now is trying to build up upon that. Some elements are brought about trilaterally. Other elements are brought about quadrilaterally through the exercises that we've seen with the Quad.
But in NATO, the members are expected to fight together ultimately.
Correct. And I think here, in this part of the world, what is really interesting is that that lack of formality, it is actually an advantage in the sense that without a political commitment to enhance that level of cooperation, you wouldn't have the training to begin with. However, by focusing on things like the reciprocal access agreements, which is about places, not bases, it's about having the ability that if I want to have a very serious piece of work with you, I will be able to preposition my fuel requirements, my ammunition requirements. I will be able to have my capabilities come in there. We can actually do the job and achieve the objective of training and enhancing our reciprocal working together without politically having the necessary implication that we, because of that, or that is the reflection of a hard rock commitment no matter what.
we should bring in the fact that, in terms of looking at China's side, Professor Chen, we've got China, Xi Jinping, ordering his military, the PLA, to have the capability to invade Taiwan or take Taiwan in 2027, which everybody has stressed this is just the capability, this is not the intention. So this is what we're seeing, perhaps, is it that we're seeing that, for example, in the Japan-Australia agreement here and many others, as we spoke about, the allies, the US allies, are also getting, building, trying to get that cooperation, that capability, should there be any contingency.
So I think the recent build-up of capabilities, either individually or together through some kind of joint exercises, are all trying to constitute a deterrent signal to China. So it is not as if all the countries are getting ready to fight in 2027. And I do think that timeline is problematic because if you say or if you claim that war will occur in 2027, then you have a lot of time to prepare for it. You have a lot of uncertainties before 2027. I think when the term 2027 is a political schedule. That's the 100 years of anniversary for Chinese PLA, right? So that's why people are starting to talk about how significant that year is. On the other hand, there is a losing age for the United States in East Asia. In terms of deployment, in terms of ammunition storage, it seems that U.S. military believe it is losing its age against PLA. But preparation for war can cause war, right? So what is important is to show that everybody, including U.S. allies, U.S. and U.S. allies, do not want to see a Taiwan contingency, and it needs to convince China that if China tries to use force to change its status quo, then U.S. and its allies will respond. Now, a few years ago, we're not sure about how U.S. allies will respond. For the past few years during the Biden administration, I think there are more and more evidence that U.S. Eastern Asia allies are concerned about Taiwan contingency, and they don't want it to happen. They are willing to do something, either to talk to China or to boost its capability in order to deter a Taiwan contingency. So I think this is a process, and it is still ongoing. And I think Japan, Australia, and maybe Philippines and Vietnam are all trying to prevent a conflict in Taiwan Strait.
Now, in terms of deterrence, Alessio, both Australia and Japan are buying US Tomahawk cruise missiles. Australia is more than 200, Japan 400, and these have a range of 1,600 kilometres. Let's take a look at what the Australian Defence Minister said about their purchase. We are investing in the capabilities our Defence Force needs to hold our adversaries at risk further from our shores and keep Australians safe in the complex and uncertain world in which we live today. So again, this is a big move, I believe, to purchase these hundreds of long-range missiles. How significant is this, Japan and Australia?
I think it is significant, and it links back to the point that Professor Chen also alluded to about deterrence. And deterrence is something that is built every day. Learning how to avoid disaster is about having a consistent form of behavior in which you are constantly communicating with your opponents and with your potential foes, right? And everybody needs to do that. And here we're having a very important statement, because it's not just about the Tomahawk, because the Tomahawk, if you want, is only part of the kill chain, as it were. The delivery platforms related to it will also increase and extend the range in this respect. And it provides submarines an element of stealth, which increases the complexity of thinking for the opponent, because they will have to pay attention closer to where these capabilities are because of that strike capacity that they would have. So in this respect, I think this is very much a clear signal in that deterrence piece, which I am also of the idea that is perfectly understood in Beijing. So it keeps that conversation going, and perhaps in doing so, it also keeps the risk of things happening a bit further down the road.
Absolutely, a great summary of it. Professor Tan, just to wrap up, final question. So we accept perhaps that there is a militarization, a growing militarization of the region. Do you believe there's an arms race?
I think, I do think it is an arms race. And this is a race, but it is not a race that somebody's getting up and another is getting up too. This arms race is like China is the leading arms producer, and other countries are trying to either boost its own defense capabilities and also introduce external help. So this goes simultaneously. Now, why do I say this? Because I don't think Japan will think it is necessary to modify its Ismo class helicopter fleet, right? And it would have cost. And Philippines certainly that didn't have to purchase or get a lot of patrol ships. This is because China is expanding militarily, and the surrounding countries, they need to expand, and they need to respond.
Basically, these countries are simply trying to defend themselves and ensure that...
I think so. Which is why I wouldn't put it as an arms race. An arms race is, for a military historian, is a very specific characteristics of action, reaction, in which timelines matter. The rest of the region has been patiently waiting and trying to find alternative ways. And now, as you say, they're trying to catch up and in a way push back. So I would say it's a modernization process with a strong emphasis on a changing perception of the urgency of the security dynamics.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Alessio and Tsang Ping Wei, thank you so much for joining us today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you next time.